Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Monday seminar. Happy to see you. We've been off, as everyone knows, for about 3 weeks, I guess, because of holidays and the EGU meeting last week in Vienna. But I'm super happy to have things start up again. And there's 3 or 4 seminars before we're going to quit for the summer. But yeah, really happy today to have Tushar Mittal joining us from Penn State. And we will follow our normal procedure, which is, I don't know, to make it pretty informal, including this part. There is a formal introduction that's done by email. And if you're not on that list and you'd like to be, I will put the simple way to join into the chat here in a few minutes. Tushar, you want to go ahead and share your screen and take over here in a second? But yeah, I suppose you've all been here before. It's a little bit of a smaller crowd right now, and maybe more people will be joining us. But our normal mode of operation is to just ask people to mute themselves and unmute if you've got some point of clarification you want to make during the talk. But we have an extended discussion and question session at the end, so there's plenty of opportunity to interact, and we really want to encourage everybody to do that. So, Tushar, thank you for joining us and for preparing the talk. And I'm going to turn things over to you.
Great. Can you see my slides and everything okay?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Chris, for the invitation. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I know a lot of people went to ETU, so they were sort of talked out. So appreciate people joining. So I want to share some of the results that we've been working on. It's a bunch of people sort of listed here, primarily at MIT, Hamid Oghaffri and Madhav Beck's lab, as well as Ben Holzman. And then there's a couple of collaborators I have at Penn State, Yashar Mahabibi and Seth Saltziel at Cornell. So this is kind of an ongoing project, and I want to kind of share some updates and some interesting results we have in terms of looking at full waveform active source data to infer the mechanical state of the system. Before I jump into sort of what we're exactly doing, I want to set up a little bit of the stage and kind of the motivation of what I'm interested in. The research focus for me in particular is focused on trying to understand rock rheology across a variety of PT conditions. And in particular, my research focuses especially on magmatic systems, on thinking about geothermal systems, less so specifically on earthquakes. So in those contexts, we care about the brittle behavior, but we also care about some of the more sort of plastic behavior to more ductile behavior. So that's shown here in the figure on the left, which is showing a cross-section as a function of depth. We go from more brittle type behavior, as shown as in the experiments on the right for marble. And then as we go to higher pressures or higher temperatures, we start to get more ductile or more sort of plastic deformation behavior. Understanding the transition between both of these and understanding how we can model that remains a key open question in geosciences. And in particular, as we go from the more brittle regime where we might have single fractures to more ductile or plastic regime where we have distributed microcracking, the relationship between stress and strain can start changing. So that's kind of shown here in the bottom with these typical stress strain curves, is that initially we have elastic loading, then we have failure, and then subsequently there is a long yielding phase where we have brittle and plastic processes interacting together with a lot of microcracks and deformation. And as I said, my perspective on this is thinking about magmatic systems. This is a nice cross-section from a National Academy report from a few years back that I like, sort of showing a cross-section of the Earth. And the thing I want to sort of highlight for the context of this talk is that rheology, and especially thinking about this transition from brittle to ductile as a function of pressure and temperature, is relevant for a number of solid or geophysical processes as we look across, especially in the crustal regime. So the magmatic systems, we care about this really a lot. We also care about this in subduction zones. And then furthermore, if you're looking at even a single earthquake system, a fault system, there are variations spatially and temporally of all these properties. And then finally, if we go and look at a lot of the focus for some of the talks on this seminar in the last few months, and looking at processes that are even shallow crustal processes, particularly in the context of geothermal and geologic carbon sequestration, understanding the response of fluid injections and how the rock behaves as a consequence of those fluid injections or stresses is really critical and remains a key source of uncertainty. And once we start adding chemical reactions to this mix, things become even more complicated. So that kind of sets up my interest in trying to understand rock rheology, and in particular, coming up with constitutive models and theoretical models where we can start understanding the stress-strain relationship. Typically, when we model these processes, there are a number of phenomenological models that exist. Some of them are shown sort of here. There's a pulse metric of them. The key point I want you to take away, not to sort of read all the text, is just that we have a lot of choices. Right? We can have something that's elastic, viscous. There are different types of viscous models. There are different types of damage models with plasticity. So there's a lot of choices, and it's not always clear, right, which is the correct one, which is consistent with the microphysical data. So on the right, on the left, I'm just showing a couple of snapshots from an experiment in marble. One is at low temperature, so we see some cracks in the calcite grains. We also see some twinning, and then as you go to deeper or higher stresses, you see more dominantly crystalloplastic twin-dominated deformation. But how do we map out what we see in this rock structure, microtexture, what we do in the lab experiments, to these phenomenological models that don't really incorporate a lot of the microphysical processes, right? So my approach in trying to address these questions has been to understand rock rheology from a variety of different perspectives, looking at theory, looking at experiments, and going in the field and looking at this. And also looking at a variety of scales, right? So there's a small scale, which is the grain scale or even micro defect scale, to then moving up to larger and larger scales, because eventually it's the interaction of these individual crystals, of the individual twins, that leads up to the behavior at the next scale, and so on and so forth. For the talk today, I'm going to focus primarily on this intermediate scale of the grain to sample scale, and thinking about how can we probe what's happening at these scales in terms of not just the bulk properties, but something about the internal dynamics, as a way to develop a rheological model that is actually microphysically consistent and process descriptive. Furthermore, we're increasingly, especially from a geochemical standpoint, increasingly collecting really detailed information on rock microtextures with methods like EBSD or diffusion profiles and so forth. And it's very challenging, at least in my perspective, I think, of connecting all of those really detailed and important information to our rheological models, that if they don't have those processes, it's hard to connect them one-to-one. Just to kind of highlight the scientific challenge, sort of to clarify that, we want to observe some of the microphysical processes during deformation. This information is really critical for developing and validating models for rock rheology. But if we just have data, as shown on the left, where this is for deformation for marble, we have strain on the x-axis and then differential stress on the y-axis. As you do different temperatures and pressures, we get different stress-strain behavior, but this is not unique, right? So if we're just trying to fit this, there could be a lot of different microphysical phenomena and microphysical processes that might end up giving us the same bulk behavior for a given experiment, right? If we take that model and try to use it for other types of stress forcing, there's no guarantee that that would work if our microphysical processes are not captured correctly. Now, this issue, I'm not the only one to point out, right? People have been thinking about this for a while. There was a couple of excellent talks about related issues in this seminar even earlier in the year. And one approach that people have been taking, which is very promising, is that we can observe this microstructure using X-ray tomography. Right? So here's a couple of papers. I think actually both of these groups had talks earlier in the seminar series. Whereas you're deforming the material, you can do X-ray tomography. And as the sample is deforming, you can look into what's happening in 3D with respect to the defects. Shown in the example on the top, whereas the sample is deformed, you can see the deformation. And then similarly in the experiment, in the set of figures at the bottom, again, as the sample is being deformed, there's X-ray tomography at high resolution that's been done that can be used to see the type of deformation and the full strain field. So this is a really promising approach to get to understanding what's happening at the micro scale, and then eventually develop models for the bulk rheology. But the challenge with this approach is that it's very intensive with regards to both doing these experiments. These require very specialized setups. And the other challenge is there's a lot of data processing that needs to be done in order to do even single experiments. So if you wanted to do tens of experiments with different forcing histories and different types of materials, this approach has some challenges. The other challenge with this approach is that although it provides us a lot of information, which can be used to understand the rheology and develop rheological models, it's a bit challenging to apply the same type of methods to a field setup, right? Where we don't, we can't do X-ray tomography on the same resolution for a field setup. Ideally, it would be great if the information that we're getting or the approach we develop in the lab can actually be scaled up to the field in at least some way. So that brings me to the other approach that I'm going to focus in the talk today, and that a lot of the group I'm working with is focused on, is trying to understand and observe the microscale processes using acoustic data. Right? And in particular, we've been looking at two complementary approaches. One is that we can have AE events. So as you're deforming the rock, you produce small microfractures or twins. We have acoustic sensors that are located, that are touching the sample on the outside. And as a consequence, you can listen to the small events. And by looking at the shape of the waveforms, where they're located and so forth, we can get some information on the AE events. And they're analogous to earthquakes in the field. The other approach is to have active source, where we can send a pulse from one side of the sample and then listen with receivers at other locations. And that's analogous to either using repeating earthquakes to probe the path effects or using ambient noise tomography in the field. So there's actually some analogy. The actual frequency content and the actual setups are different between the lab and the field. So they're not exactly one-to-one, but there's a point of connection at least. So what I'm going to show you today is some work particularly focused on active source. We look in a lot of the experiments that I'm going to show you results from. We have both AE events, sort of the passive source, as well as active source. But just in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the active source analysis and trying to see, what information can we get. To make sure everybody is on the same page, a lot of people do this type of analysis already, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page, the basic setup is that we have a sample, it's being deformed, and we have two sensors. So we have a sensor at the top of the sample, we have a sensor at the bottom. At a given point in time, you send a pulse from the top, and then you listen at the base. In some way, it's a way to probe what's happening as the sample is going. It's sort of an idea of the same idea of sort of pump and probe type analysis. the figure on the right shows an example of a numerical simulation that we've done where we have a finite element model. And if you send a probe, a pulse on one side, and it's propagating, you can see it's going to sample a large volume of the sample, and then eventually it's going to be received by the sensor on the right. This approach is very analogous, or is exactly similar to ambient noise analysis that's done in seismology very actively right now, where we have one source and then one receiver. So when we send a pulse from the source, it gets scattered in the medium, right, because of defects or damaged sources and so forth, and we'll receive it at the sensor. If subsequently there's any change in the medium because of deformation processes or fluid flow and so forth, that changes a little bit of the path that the waves are taking. And as a consequence, when we look at the waves in the receiver, there are small changes in phase shifts. And in particular, if we send a pulse and we measure it at the receiver, we initially have the P wave arrival, because that's the fastest velocity. Then we get S wave. Then we get some of the surface waves as well as the coda, right? And the coda in this context is really the waves that we're getting because of this multiple scattering. In the case of the field, that's because of multiple scattering. In the case of the lab samples, there's also scattering from the boundaries of the sample. The key concept that I'm going to try and use or test in the work I'm going to show is the idea that the coda waves are actually a lot more sensitive to the internal structure as opposed to the direct P wave arrivals. And the conceptual reason for thinking of that is that the coda waves are because of multiple scattering in the medium. So they actually have a lot more volume sampling as opposed to P wave arrivals that are telling you about the path effects, but the direct path between the source and the receiver. Since the coda waves are scattering multiple times, they're also more complicated to understand and analyze because in some regards, you don't quite know which exact location they're going through. Whereas if we're looking at the P wave arrivals, we kind of have some more direct idea of you have the source and the receiver, what's the shortest path. So to illustrate how, to understand how sensitive coda waves might be with regards to some of the internal structures of the medium, we've done some simulations in COMSO where it's a 2D simulation. We have a pulsing sensor on the left, and then one probe point on the right. So that's going to be analogous to what we can do in the lab, for instance. And in this case, the thing that's changing from the top to the bottom on the left-hand side is we put some damage zone. So that's region that has slightly different elastic properties. And when they do simulations to look at what's going to happen in what does the probe point record? And that's shown on the right. So if you just focus on the figure on the top, the x-axis is showing time. So what is the probe point receiving over time? And then the y-axis is showing just the velocity at that location. And each of these colors, so the blue is the sample setup on the top, where we have a small thin elastic layer damage zone. And as we increase the damage zone, the P wave arrivals don't change very much. There's a small shift in the P wave arrival potentially, but especially given the noise in real data sets, it's going to be really hard to measure. But when we start looking at the coda, we start seeing interesting, complex but interesting changes in the structure of the coda. So in particular, you can start to see some small bifurcations. So if you look at the blue curve, there's a smooth decrease versus if we look at the green one, where we have the largest area and thickness of the elastic layer. You see small changes in the structure. So that's the kind of thing that we want to look at, is that if we can we can realistically distinguish these small features, that has information about the state of damage within our sample. So even if we can't do imaging directly, even a single sensor data set actually has information in the coda about what is the state of damage at the medium. So this is a simulation, and that kind of motivates the experimental results and analysis that I'm going to be showing, trying to sort of test this idea in realistic settings. And again, this idea of looking at details of the coda is not new, right? There's a lot of people on this call, and a number of people have been looking at this kind of approaches for more brittle dominated deformation, right? So this is one of the classic papers from 2017, which looked at this, where they looked at, for earthquake friction, what is the time to failure? If we have continuous active source data, can look at what are some of the changes that are occurring in the structure of the waveform, and use that to come up with a prediction. But that's primarily in the brittle dominated regime. And what we want to look at for our work is to think of it across regions where you don't have necessarily one fault plane, but more distributed damage. Does this kind of approach still work? So that's going to set up kind of the conjecture that I'm going to be testing with the results in this talk, is that the full time domain structure of the active source coda waveforms is both necessary and is also sufficient to constrain the rheological state of the rock volume. And we want to not only say, it can do it, but we want to have some predictive model, because eventually the goal is to have some quantitative rheological model. So I want to test it, not just saying that there's a correlation, but use quantitatively, say, can you use just the waveform to tell something about the stress state of the rock sample, the strain state of the rock sample? And we want to do this across the brittle to semi-brittle to ductile regime, and not just focusing on earthquake friction type perspectives. So the approach is going to be to test this conjecture. Going to use a lab acoustic data set for deformation for Carrara marble. That's going to span from confining pressures of 10 to 250 MPa. And the reason for using marble is that it has a nice property that as we go from 10 MPa to 25, 50, 75, 100, 150, 200, we can span the whole regime of going from having more brittle dominated behavior, so you can start getting faulting, to start having transitional behavior, where we're getting semi-brittle deformation, to more ductile deformation. And you can sort of see that in these images, which is showing what does the sample look like at the end of the experiment. In the brittle regime, we get a nice clean, nice fault forming. You don't see that in the ductile regime, but the sample overall starts to deform. So these experiments were done at were done at MIT. We have a paper in PNAS from last year that analyzes the acoustic events from this particular setup. So if you have any if you're interested more in the setup, I would encourage you to go to look at that. But just sort of as a quick overview, what we're looking at here is that we have a sample, we're deforming it, and then we have an AE sensor at the bottom and at the top. So the top one is going to be our pulsar, and the bottom one is going to be our receiver. So in this study, I'm going to only focus on what is the relationship for the active source with regards to deformation, that as we're deforming these samples. And we know that these span the right regimes not only by looking at the macroscopic structure shape of the samples, but we've also done some EBSD work on a couple of these samples. And we can see that you go from more crag-dominated in the brittle regime to more twin-dominated, which is going to be more crystal plastic dominated as you go to higher pressures. So we know that this experiment set is spanning the type of, it has the diversity in terms of deformation behavior that we want to test this method across. we want to have enough diversity in our experiment set that we can actually test the conjecture that it works across regimes rather than in a very specific regime per se. Okay, so what does the data look like? So here's some data for what the 25 MPa experiment looks like. So on the far left is showing the active pulsing data. X-axis is showing time, and then the y-axis is just showing what these active pulses data look like as we're going through the experiment. The key thing to sort of see is that you have the initial effect because of the pulsing, then there's a p-wave arrival. But then as we look at later in the coda, there's a lot of changes in the structure that are occurring. And we see a really strong shift in the structure of the coda, especially when we go from the elastic part of the loading phase curve. So we are initially loading the sample, and then once we start yielding, and fracturing, that's where we start to see the changes in the coda. And then there's even some changes in the coda that's occurring subsequently as the sample continues to yield more plastically. There's going to be some changes in the p-wave arrivals. If we just follow the time period that's showing the p-wave arrival on the figure on the left, you can see that right around the time period where we have the change, where we go from elastic to brittle deformation and then plastic yielding, there's a change in the p-wave, but that initial p-wave arrival doesn't continue to evolve too much. There's maybe subtle changes, but it's not changing a lot. And just to see how different this is compared to more of a brittle regime to ductile, here's the example for a ductile regime. So this is at 150 MPa. Again, we see a lot of changes, interesting changes in the coda. And that's a lot more dominant and clear as opposed to looking at changes in the p-wave velocity. So the p-wave velocity maybe slightly changes, but it's not so distinctive. And partly in this case, we don't have a clear yielding phase. It's sort of a continuous yielding as you're going from purely elastic to semi-brittle to then sort of plastic deformation behavior. So it's features like this. Yep.
It's Chris. Just can I interrupt for a second?
Yes.
Can you go back one slide? Because
Yep.
I wasn't sure that I understood the 10 MPa slide. On the far left, it looks like, and I don't know if I'm lagging or you are, but you're still on the 150 MPa slide for me. But on the far left, okay, you have I suppose these the blue things are the differential stress
Yes.
point, and then but it looks like there's several lines that make up the cumulative AEs. Is that true, or is it are there multiple experiments here? Maybe I'm just not sure I follow.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, that was my bad. I should have explained that. So the data on the left is the active source. Those points are the individual AE events that we're getting as we are doing the experiment. So that's just that's a micro earthquakes. That's the passive AEs.
And the size of them is something about the magnitude. Is that are they circles?
The size of them is something about the magnitude. Yeah, size of them is something about the magnitude. Yeah. So there is a complementary AE data set also to this. I'm not going to really talk about it just in the interest of time. So we're doing continuous pulsing, and then there's also in between them, then there's some times where you can listen to AEs that are occurring through.
In the strains, the differential stress versus strain between B and C is the same or different? Two different.
I think they should be the same. There might be a little bit of the main difference, I think, is that on the B one, it's just only plotting it at the times where there were AEs, and then in C, that's showing the full curve. So
okay, understood. Okay.
I'll show this like a little bit more. Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, sorry. Okay. So this is just to kind of show a little bit of what the data looks like. So let's kind of look at all of it together. So this is just, rather than looking at two experiments, what does all of the data look like? So this is stacking up all of the different experiments data that we have, all the active source data. So at the bottom, is the 10 MPa, then there is the 25 MPa, 50 MPa, 75, 100, 150, and then 250 MPa. So we have all these experiments, and this is sort of all what the active source data looks like. So if you look at something right at the top, how the structure of the waveform is changing during the experiments. Again, these are the same type of experiments. You have confining, you have constant strain rate, so you build up differential stress. The structure of these waveforms, you can see in the bottom, you start at the experiments right at the bottom at 10 MPa. There are some sharp changes that occur as you do the experiment. If you look at right at the top, which is going to be our ductile regime, we don't see that sharp shifts in the active source data, especially in the coda, during the process of the experiment. So that just starts to get some hint, okay, that there may be information in here about what is the rheological state of the sample just by looking at the active source data. Okay. So we started by saying, okay, we want to look at this, and let's start with the simplest cases and then build up complexity. So the first thing we can look at is what does the coda wave velocity looks like. So for each of these cases, we look at some of the initial arrival part of the coda, the first few microseconds, and use a stretch shrinking method to estimate what the velocity is. So you stretch or shrink the waveform with respect to the initial one to look at and find the maximum cross correlation to find small shifts in the velocity. We've tried a few different methods using spectral approaches also, and you basically get very similar results. So if you look at the experiment on the top, we have strain on the x-axis, and you're deforming the sample. Once you go to yielding, then the differential stress is going to keep decreasing. There's a change in the velocity. It starts off a little bit before you have the peak stress. That's probably indicating some form of sort of changes in the damage occurring. And then we see the primary change in the velocity during the yielding phase. And then subsequently, during the more plastic deformation, there's not a very strong change in the velocity. But you can still see, the different regions of the deformation behavior and the rheological response in the velocity. And we can do the same for all the different experiments. So if you look at the 150 MPa one, that's the one at the on the right, close to the bottom. There's not a characteristic drop like the one in the first, like the case of the brittle case, right? It's more sort of continuous, and it keeps reducing velocity. In the stress strain curve, the stress sort of keeps building up, right? It's not yielding, it's not dropping analogous to what it was doing in the brittle case. This is 150 is going to be ductile, so it's going to deform very differently. So by looking at all of this, we can start to see, okay, within the context of a single experiment, yes, there are changes in the velocity that are potentially diagnostic of what the rheological state of the system is. But is this, if you just measured the velocity, right? Because our conjecture was just by knowing the active waveform, you can tell what the rheological state of the sample is when you know nothing else. So if you just knew velocity, could you say whether you are ductile or brittle, for instance? So we wanted to test that.
Tushar, could I interrupt, please?
Yes, please. Yep.
Tushar, for the 250 MPa experiment, are we looking at these sort of pulse-like features in the AE? Are these real, or are they artifact?
I think, yeah, those are artifacts in the velocity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So those are artifacts that for the analysis later on, I'm just going to, those will be filtered out. Yeah. Okay. So we looked at, so the common features to look at are velocity. Then the other things that people also look at is looking at the cross correlation coefficient, as well as the amplitude. Right? So So on the figure on the left, I'm just kind of showing all the experiments all together. So at the top, just showing what is the differential stress for the different experiments as you're going from brittle to ductile, and then showing what does the velocity field look, what does the change in velocity looks like, as well as what is the change in the cross-correlation coefficient, the peak of the cross-correlation coefficient. And in all of these cases for cross-correlation, I'm going to reference it to the undamaged 10 MPa sample. Again, I'm not doing cross-correlation with respect to its own experiment because we want to compare with respect to each other and across the different experiments. Can we pick out where you are just based on velocity, cross-correlation, or amplitude, the peak amplitude or the transmissivity, for instance, of the waveform? And we started with these three features of the CODA because these have been used previously in a number of studies, again, primarily in the friction context, just say that these have a lot of information about the state of the system. These could potentially even uniquely, in most cases, tell us about the state of the system. So we want to test it, start it with these as a base case and seeing what else information do we need, or are these enough to distinguish between the different setups, different stress states. So just as a way to quickly look at them, right? Are these going to be unique or not? We can look at, so if we look at the figure on the left, that's showing the different experiments, the different confining stresses. And then the y-axis is showing the velocity that is sampled during that particular experiment. And then the histograms underneath are basically showing their normalized per velocity bit. So for instance, if you have a velocity of 4,000 meters per second, you can be pretty confident that that's only going to be the case at a low pressure experiment. Versus if you are 6,000 meters per second, then there's a number of different experiments where you could have got that velocity at a given point in time. The same thing applies for amplitude and cross-correlation. Some aspects of it are unique, but a lot of the large part of the space, you can, if you know the confining pressure independently, then yes, you can sort of say, okay, here's what's happening within my experiment. I can go and look at the changes in the velocity and tell you kind of approximately where the stress might be. But if you look at them all together, there's not a unique velocity, amplitude, or a cross-correlation that can be used to distinguish between the stress state, the confining pressure, or the differential stress, for instance, across all the experiments. So this is for confining stress. This becomes even more trickier if you're trying to compare the differential stress that's in the experiment, in the sample. The changes in the velocity with respect to the initial velocity in the sample are not unique across the whole space. Similarly, the amplitude is not unique, as well as the cross-correlation coefficient. So individually, they're not unique enough to say, if we measure all three of these, we can tell exactly where we are with regards to our brittle ductile regime and our stress state and confining pressure state. So this already tells us this is probably not enough, but we wanted to test it a little bit further to say, maybe a given velocity is not unique and a given amplitude is not unique. But if you know velocity, amplitude, and cross-correlation, is that sufficient to tell you all three of them together something about the stress state of the system? So to do that, what we ended up doing was did a bunch of different types of regression models. So this is a little bit busy, so I'll kind of walk you through because I'll show a few of these kind of figures. So if we look at each of at a single panel at the top, the x-axis is showing what is the predicted value from the regression model. And the y-axis is showing what is the actual value from the regression model. And I'm trying a variety of models increasing in complexity. So we have a least square and a ridge regression initially. Then we do a least squares adding some polynomial features. So it could depend on velocity and velocity squared and velocity cubed. Trying a few different versions to reduce the number of free parameters. So that's sort of the Bayesian ridge regressions with polynomial components. And then finally, at the bottom two, using fairly nonlinear models, such as random forest and an ADA boost regression model, which is another tree-based method. Try and see, okay, maybe there's not a linear relationship or a quadratic relationship, but there's some nonlinear relationship. But just with velocity, and for all of these cases, what we do is we take 50% of the data, use that for training, and 50% is for testing. So I've tried cases where you can even only give 20% for training and using most of it for regression for testing. It doesn't change the results very much materially, and so forth. So just with velocity, as you can see, the confining stress prediction is not very good, right? It has some pattern, but overall, even with the random forest model, we have really large differences between what you should be, which should be the red line, that's a one-to-one line in each of these plots. You have a lot of data that's scattering outside it. So we can give it some more features. So we can start by saying, okay, let's give it velocity, cross correlation, and amplitude all together. Now adding all three, we start getting a lot better predictions. So that already tells us actually three of them together in combination has more information. And in particular, the random forest and the ADA boost models have a lot more predictability and accuracy compared to any of the linear regression models. For these, for the nonlinear models, we also looked at which features are the most important. So by using feature importance methods, we can quantify which of them ones are most important. And we find that the velocity has the most dominant effect, followed by amplitude and maximum cross correlation. And just to make sure that we're not just picking up random noise, we also added a feature that was random. So we just gave it random data as one of the features and use that to test when we do our feature importance that the random should be really low, right? If random dominated, that means that it's not making a good prediction and the feature importance is not being correctly calculated. So we already see some decent results when we're looking at velocity, cross correlation, amplitude all together. But when we start looking at some of the other features, so not just confining stress, but something like differential stress. So again, just giving velocity, cross correlation, and amplitude, and trying to predict differential stress across all the experiments, so not just one, across all the experiments together. Random forest seems to do okay-ish, but there's a lot of scatter. And then some of the more simpler models that are potentially a bit more interpretable, like even something like the ordinary least squares with polynomial components, have a lot of scatter. And as a last test, so again, multiple features matter for this, much more significant than random. And then as a last test, we wanted to say, okay, let's try to sort of push it to the limit, where what we're now doing is we're saying, okay, you give velocity, cross correlation, amplitude, you have to predict the differential stress, and you want to predict the strain. So if we look at just the panel of figures at the bottom, that's showing the stress and the strain. The black is the actual data from all the experiments together. And red is the prediction from the trained model, trained on 50% of the data, predicting the rest 50. And then the panels have been going from the left to the right. The bottom left, each of them is showing what is the actual strain that is predicted, and then what is the error, the difference between the data and the model for strain and stress. So even though this kind of captures broadly some of the features, right, the reds are, especially for the random forest, lie on top of the data, point to point, comparing the data and the model, the real data and the model, there's significant errors in the strain and in particularly in the stress. So what's partly promising about this, it says, okay, there's some information to uniquely characterize the stress strain state of the sample, right? And we're not giving any time lag information. You just give it at a single time stress strain, at a single time the velocity, amplitude, and cross correlation coefficients, and try to predict it. One could potentially make it better by using some time lagged information. But even with this sort of fairly hard problem, it does somewhat okay. But this is only using a little bit of the information of the waveform. There's potentially a lot more information in the waveform. So we wanted to try and extract some of it and do this where we're seeing what else can we get by looking at more of the full aspects of the waveform together. Now, one of the challenges is that if we look at a given waveform, so that's just showing the same data, all the data on the left-hand side, individual time snaps in the waveform are not all independent to each other, right? So we can give it our 2000 time steps of the waveform and say, use that all to predict, but that's a lot of data. And then at some point in time, one might worry that you're just overfitting things together. So as a step to add a little bit of complexity for the waveform, but not given the full waveform directly, we tried some dimensionality reduction approaches. We tried a bunch of them. The one that in practice works the best for the results I'm going to show you is called UMAP. So what UMAP does is it's a nonlinear dimensionality reduction method where the idea is that we take some data, we make a local graph from the data. So that's sort of shown here in steps where you have some data, you look at the local neighborhood of your points, produce a graph that preserves the structure, some of the local as well as the global structure. And if you have a high dimensional data set, so in the case of the waveform, each of the time steps of the waveform will be a feature. So you have a 2000 dimensional graph that you're trying to then represent in a 2 or 3 dimensional space. And what UMAP tries to do, and does fairly well compared to a lot of other algorithms, is that it preserves the local and global structure of the graph pretty accurately. So as a result, we can get some idea, rather than giving it the full waveform, we can take our data, our waveforms, project it into 2-dimensional space in UMAP, which is shown on the right. And if we color it by the stresses, we can see that actually this 2-dimensional projection is already pretty good in distinguishing where we are with regards to confining stress. So UMAP is not picking at any given aspect of the waveform. It's looking at all of the waveform together, but finding a very low dimensional representation that captures this information. With only 2 to 5 features, so you don't add hundreds of features additionally to your data. So by doing UMAP, we can start looking, okay, what is the effect of UMAP if we start adding UMAP to the same type of tests that we did before? So if we try to predict confining stress, where we have velocity, cross-correlation, amplitude, and 2 UMAP features. Now, especially for the context of the ADA boost and random forest, we basically are getting almost perfect predictions. We can look at what are the features that are most important in trying to, for the random forest or ADA boost models. The exact feature importance is a little bit different between the 2 models, but the key point here is that, yes, velocity matters, yes, cross-correlation coefficient matters, but the UMAP features are also important. So UMAP 0, UMAP 1, so these are the 2 dimensions of the UMAP, are pretty important in being able to get that accurate prediction. And UMAP 0 is more important than the amplitude of the waveform in being able to predict where you are with regards to confining stress. You can do the same thing now for looking at, if we do 3 UMAP features, even with a Bayesian, with a linear least squared regression type model, we can start to get pretty accurate results. We can do the same thing for differential stress. So adding UMAP improves the prediction for the differential stress significantly compared to what we had before. And again, when we look at the feature importance for these, amplitude, velocity, and then a UMAP features are going to be really important in being able to predict these the differential stress from just looking at the velocity, cross correlation, amplitude, and the UMAP. And then we do the same thing for strain. Again, you can do a pretty decent prediction. And then finally, we put it all together and we use the UMAP to kind of do that hard task. We've added a couple of UMAP features. We start to get a lot more accurate predictions for the full stress strain curve. So you're predicting the stress and the strain based on just the time instantaneous velocity, cross correlation, amplitude, and UMAP features of the waveform. We can start to get a lot more accurate predictions of what is the rheological state of the stress strain state of the system is. And again, this is only showing it with 2 UMAP. If we add a few more, the accuracy sort of starts to increase even more as it starts to capture more of the aspects of the waveform structure overall. So overall, we found this was pretty promising in showing that, okay, from adding some information of the waveform, from the structure of the waveform, can be really important in trying to improve the prediction and trying to predict where we are with regards to the rheological state. But we wanted to push this a little bit further and ask, why does UMAP work, right? What are the aspects of the waveform that it's actually using so that we can get to the process? Now, the challenge with doing that, right? So one could ask, okay, which is the exact aspects, parts of the waveform that UMAP is using? The challenge with UMAP, it's very good in doing non-dimensional, nonlinear reduction, but it's very nonlinear. And as a result, it doesn't have a clear sensitivity that you can't go in and say, this time step in the waveform is what it's used. Furthermore, a lot of the waveform is redundant information because if you're having a waveform come in, it's going to bounce around. So there's a lot of correlated aspects of the waveform that are not easily, if we just do feature importance, we can get correlated information back. So what we ended up doing was to develop a method using another unsupervised learning approach called ICA. So that's an independent component analysis. And what that really does is basically decomposes a given signal into distinct uncorrelated signals, with the idea that if we have a bunch of different sources of signal coming in, pass it through ICA, it tries to figure out what are the independent components that are making up the signal. Again, it's a modification of some of the approaches like PCA with the added idea of finding independent components rather than just finding components that produce the variance. We're trying to find independent components that make up the signal that you're seeing. So within the context of our analysis, ICA was really useful in taking the waveforms and reducing it to a smaller subset of independent components, asking whether they could be even reduced to smaller subcomponents, and then using those to understand what UMAP is doing to reduce the dimensions further. So we start with data like this, which is all the waveform data, all of the experiments combined together. And if we only use 20 modes across all this experimental data set, we can reproduce all the full waveform, the waveform information almost exactly. So the error, so the scale of this is minus 1.5 to 1.5 normalized amplitudes. And then this is the error. So this is the difference between what the ICA predicts with 20 modes versus what's actually being with all the data across different types of experiments. So that already starts to tell us, okay, there's actually not just lots of different types of processes occurring. There's only a few independent modes that we're seeing in different types of experiments, representing different types of damage mechanisms. So what we ended up doing was by looking at the UMAP, we can start looking at what are the modes. And what we typically find is that a given experiment or a given type of deformation is characterized by transitions in a few modes together. We look at what these modes look like. So this is just picking a couple of these modes, showing the mode amplitude, the spectrogram. As we go from mode 11, which is dominating the low frequency, the lower pressure experiments to mode 2 and 17 that are dominating the high pressure experiments, the more ductile behavior, we start to see subtle changes in the frequency, a little bit more high frequency content coming in, but also the structure of those is different in time domain. So using this and doing a bunch of sort of back processing that I'm happy to talk to people offline or later after the rest of the seminar, we can figure out basically in the parameter space, what is UMAP actually picking out in the context of the modes. So if we take the UMAP features, discretize it in space, so we break it into different components, and then we can look at, okay, what's actually happening for the cluster number 0. If you look in the figure on the right, that's representing one aspect, one phase space in UMAP space, and that's actually taking a bunch of modes together and using them to distinguish cluster 0 versus cluster 1. So conceptually, what UMAP seems to be doing is taking these modes, which are representing different frequency structures, and hence representing different types of damage and moduluses in the sample, and remove and finding actually even those are correlated with each other, and I can reduce that down to a few dimensions. In the last few minutes, I just want to kind of wrap up and just say, why does it work and what sort of does it mean about physical interpretation of samples? The way we've been sort of interpreting a lot of these results is that if we started with things where the damage in the rock was completely random, using a single receiver, right? We're only using a single receiver from a pulsing might not be enough to uniquely distinguish what's happening. But if we look at in real rock samples, this is again using one of the results of the papers that I mentioned before, which had X-ray tomography. And if you look at what's actually happening with deformation, there's a lot of correlated structure, right? So you're not producing damage randomly within the sample. Damage is being produced in a correlated manner. And as a consequence, there's only so many ways that when the active waveform is coming in, it's getting reflected and bounced back. And sampling the medium, there is certain types of structure that it's picking up in the waveform that gets represented in the coda. And even in this particular experiment, we looked at some of their active waveform data where the tomography was being done. What we found was actually UMAP does a very good job. So if we show the figure on the left, the bottom, that's showing the UMAP 1 and 2 dimensions for the active source for this particular data set. And then the color is showing the stress state. So the UMAP waveform features are distinguishing where you are with regards to stress relatively accurately. So overall, what we're finding is that the active source is really sensitive to the microstructure. It has the potential to being able to actually predict a lot of the stress state, the bulk rheological state of the sample, because it's sensitive to the damage, which is correlated with a certain type of stress strain conditions. And it's by picking up essentially those correlations that is why the active waveform potentially has information on being able to say something about the stress state and the rheological state of the sample. So kind of the next steps that we're working on right now is that we have AE data for a lot of this also that we've analyzed. So we're trying to combine this and look at if knowing active source data, can you start to predict a waveform clustering properties or AE rate information? And we have some promising results for those. And then lastly, sort of closing the loop and trying to use this into rheological models. So that's a project that just started as part of the DOE Earthshots to develop a constitutive model that directly takes in active source data as part of predicting what the rheology would be over time. So I'll stop there and take some questions. Thank you.
That was great. Really, really interesting talk. So I'll invite people to unmute, turn on their camera if they'd like to join me in thanking Tushar for really a fabulous talk. Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff. Yeah, great. And easiest thing to do is to use there's a little feature at the bottom of Zoom. I suppose you're all experts, but in the reactions button, you can raise your hand and that'll put us in some order to ask questions and probably make a little bit more organized discussion. And Paul Johnson has volunteered to show us how to do it with his hand raised. So, Paul,
Thanks, Chris.
go ahead.
Really interesting talk, Tushar. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I guess I'm wondering, the very first question is, I know you thought about generalization.
Yes.
but let's hear your thoughts on generalization, what you've tried. 2 slides ago, you showed us results from the Taylor and forgotten the name, sorry.
Yeah.
But I wasn't sure exactly what you had done or if you'd done
Right.
anything with those data. So, but anyway, I sort of digress. What are your thoughts on generalization? I think that would be challenging, but I want to see what you think.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree it will be challenging. And so, so to answer sort of part of the question, so what I did was in that paper, they had active source data that they nicely provided. So I did some analysis just to look at, what does the active source data look like? They had mostly focused on the velocity. So they just calculated the velocity, but most of the focus of the paper was the X-ray tomography. That in principle is actually a good data set because there is co-located lots of different data streams, so you can really understand the microphysics side of things. I think from a generalization standpoint, what I think, eventually I would like, I think if this were to work, right, you want to try it in the field, and that's kind of the overall motivation. I think there's a few steps to get to those. Where I think the promising approach for me is that using the experiment set that we have and using other experiments that have this kind of data, right? A lot of experiments have active source full waveform data. Seeing, okay, does this method, if you use the same approach, does this work across different experiments? And as we're developing the rheological models that include this, we start building up a little bit of a theoretical framework rather than just saying, this correlates and this is good prediction. We want to have something about what are the types of damage that we're actually producing. I think that once that framework is solid, especially with a good theoretical underpinning, that to me then starts to make a good case to we can start generalizing, especially going up to different experiments or going up to different, or even sort of field settings where people do see changes in ambient noise tomography in structure of the waveforms coming in. Is that actually, can you use that to say something about the stress and strain state of the system? Even if, it has some uncertainty, getting some constraints directly from the waveform could be really interesting and promising.
Right.
There's a few steps to get to that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's hard to imagine that if you're trained on, for example, a Carrara marble,
Right.
would apply to a granite, for example.
Right.
But the question is, how different would the results be? And I guess you're going to find out as you go along.
Right.
But what your goal is admirable. It sounds very challenging, but if it ultimately worked or partially worked, it could really be a game changer.
Right. Yeah, I think it's part of it. What I hope is it provides some information, and you have other data sets that using it, and then especially if you have the micro earthquakes, the passive A's, that's also telling you about the source mechanism. So in the Carrara marble and some of the other setups, if we have both, then we can start to actually also cross-check, right? Like we think this type of damage is occurring, this produces this type of waveform structure. In the active source, do we see those type of deformation? Do we see those in the passive events also? So there's some information I think there. Once you combine both of them together to push it further, a bit more, be more accurate.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Really interesting.
Thanks.
Tushar, I'll just make a suggestion as we move through the questions here. And Michele, I'm going to let you go next if you don't mind. But Tushar, maybe you wouldn't mind sharing your screen and showing your PowerPoint, at least part of it, maybe just not in full screen mode so that people could see,
Yes.
I don't know, particular plots they're asking questions about. And I'd just like to encourage, especially if you've not been with us before, it might seem like, I should just let the experts, like people like, Ian Main ask questions, but raise your hand and join the discussion. Because this is the point of this seminar, is to have an extended discussion with lots of people having a chance to chime in and say something. Michele, please.
Hi, Chris, thank you. And thanks for the really nice talk. I was just wondering, you showed us that you used the amplitude as one of the measures to try to infer the state of the rheology, right?
Yes.
I was thinking, and actually it's a discussion that we already done with Chris and other colleagues here in Sapienza, if that picking the maximum to the minimum of the waveform is a right measure for transmissivity. So if it does not have some pitfall while the waveform during the experiment change, as you showed in some amplitude maps.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I think, I didn't explore this too much within the context of this particular analysis, but I've looked at using spectral amplitude rather than just the peak amplitude of the waveform, because that I think is a little bit more stable and maybe has a bit more sort of physical meaning rather than just the amplitude. So for some of the AE data directly, I've used that, and that I think is one potential way to get some more stable information. The thinking for me right now with what I showed was people have used amplitude and transmissivity as just defined as like the maximum amplitude. So I wanted to compare and see, okay, if you include that, how important is that in being able to distinguish it? But it's a good point that even across some different experiments, like it's sort of normalized amplitude, but there can be changes that may be not because of the sample paths effects, but something with the sensors or with the forcing coming in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, following up on that really quickly before we go to Ian Main, Tushar, I was wondering, like the amplitude, you just pick the peak, you don't try to connect it to P wave or some other thing, you just take the peak.
Yeah, so in this case, I'm looking at the coda part, so I'm just kind of filtering out from the time side what the P wave is. So I'm looking at the coda and then the peak amplitude in the coda of the wave. Yeah, in the coda. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Ian Main.
Hi, I really enjoyed that. It was good to see the sort of breadth of experiments you've done, and also what you've done with the waveform data in the experiments that we did, and put the open source link in the paper. So it's really nice to see that. So the question is, it's on the predictive model. Could you go back to the slide where you showed the kind of the different methods and the kind of it's the stress history against the fitted.
Yes,
maybe it's that one.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a really complicated error structure, or maybe I'm not interpreting it correctly. But
right.
You couldn't use a simple Gaussian assumption, or even maximum likelihood might struggle. I mean, it probably does need this nonlinear approach that you're, sort of advocating. It just looks like a very different and difficult inverse problem.
Right. Like I think I agree. Like my expectation when I did it, I was sort of like, this will not work at all, right? So I was surprised that it gives something, especially with the random forest stuff. And some of the nonlinear models actually get something that is that is not just completely all over the place, right? Because in this case, I tried to do a harder problem because I think I've played around with this a little bit to improve the predictions, where you can give it some time lag information, right? So you're not giving just the velocity now or the amplitude now, but over some over some time steps, right? So I think this to me is kind of like the end member of how worse it could be. I think there are ways to improve it. We haven't fully optimized it. But I was sort of using it as to me saying, okay, the idea to test kind of the conjecture that we started with, like, do you need this information? I think there's a lot more in the waveform that can be used to understand the rheology structure. And part of the challenge, I think to me, maybe, kind of I should have maybe put this explicitly as a take-home message, is that typically even in ambient noise analysis, we look at all the cross correlation structure, then get a single velocity to represent the whole cross correlation lag information. Looked at all of the lag information that has a lot more all of that lags that has information that could actually be physically meaningful. We'll have to calibrate it, right, by doing these clean experiments, but I think there's a lot more that could be extracted.
Yeah, I mean, it means you can use rate as well as state, if you like, as a
Right.
variable to improve the forecast.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to suggest. I mean, it's a very long process if you wanted to do that. You know, using standard sort of Markov chain, Monte Carlo nonlinear inversion.
Yes.
But sometimes it does get stuck in these you know, these sub patterns that you're seeing there with maybe 4 straight lines in the top middle diagram.
Right.
It might do that as well. So we've been using, for seismic hazard analysis on a much bigger scale, we've been using something called the integrated nested Laplace approximation, which does assume a Gaussian fit,
Right.
but it also includes the mapping of the Gaussian random field element for things, for covariates which you cannot see. It sort of identifies where there might be, I don't know, heat flow anomaly changing the seismicity or something like that, but you haven't got that in the actual database.
Right.
But I just think this is an awkward problem. So
yes.
good luck.
Yeah, like I think, you know, what we're hoping to do is, like, you know, the predictive model to me is more of saying, is there information or not, right? If the predictive model were to completely fail, then you're like, maybe there's not enough information. I think to me, this is indicating enough that there's information. Then it comes down to the question of how much do you want to optimize this particular experiment set versus more experiments and generalization. And we're developing a lot of theoretical framework, which includes thermodynamics and includes some machine learning components to learn rheology. That's more nonlinear. So I think that will do a lot of the optimization kind of questions specifically. But it's sort of, to me right now, I think this is a case of saying, like, there's information that we should be at least trying to use about the state.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Ali, go ahead, and I'll just remind people that we still have about 15 minutes before.
Thank you.
Circle back to the day. Ali, go ahead.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting talk, and it brought up a lot of questions. So maybe some of them later I can ask, but at least for now, this. Do you think that we can use such a thing to talk about source mechanisms? To say that, for example, we have tensile, shear, or something, can we distinguish between them?
So I think, you know, it's what we've had more success doing, and this is sort of in the PNAS paper from last year, is that from the from the AE events directly, the structure of the waveform is distinguishing between the different types of source events. So even if you don't know source location or moment tensors, the structure of the waveform can distinguish it. And we've now done a bunch of subsequent follow-ups to kind of confirm that. I think from the context of active source data, you know, I would say maybe like if I had to sort of push it, I would say, you know, where I think there might be a hope is that since, like, especially with the IC analysis, when you see what the different components are, there are differences in the structure of what the individual components and their spectral properties are, which to me is essentially mapping onto the damage and the modulus changes in the sample. And if you have tensile, again, you might not be distinguishing between a single tensile and a single twin, but you say, you know, if it's dominantly twin, they interact and produce a type of structure that is going to be different than dominantly tensile. And I think that is what is essentially picked up by the modes in the frequency content, and that is what is then used to essentially predict. So I think, you know, maybe from the dominant side, I think we can do that. Individually at a given time, you say, you know, I have a certain event occurring or certain event might occur, will it be tensile or plastic? I think that's going to be difficult to do with active source only.
I see.
If you combine active and passive, then you can get that information a lot more. But I think dominant you can say something about what's happening in the sample dominantly.
Great, thank you. And about the depth and the application, in fact, of the work, I saw that you at the start you showed this going to ductile behavior. It goes to very deep, more than 10 kilometers. You go to these changes. So when we are in geothermals or carbon storage, we are lower. So do you want to distinguish between what is happening, for example, in geothermal reservoir and the kind of induced earthquakes probability? So you want to distinguish between these two events?
Yeah, so I think, maybe I should be more clear. What I was trying to basically say was, I think, like in the standard crustal structures, you would get more ductile behavior deeper down. But in a geothermal setting, for instance, you get, because of higher temperature, you can get some of these plastic deformation processes, even occurring at shallower depths. And the idea would be is, can you use ambient noise tomography or active source information to map out the rheological state of your geothermal reservoir, right? Or a magmatic system where people see changes from the data. Can we use this type of information to map the stress strain state back out, where we only have the seismic information and nothing else?
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for this nice talk.
Yeah, interesting questions. Yeah, Tushar, go ahead.
Yeah, Tushar, you and I obviously have had many conversations, but it was actually nice to hear you talk. I'd never seen it before, so this was really enjoyable for me. My question was, and this might be a naive one, it kind of builds on Paul's question, how much is the final trained model that you get at the end depend on the specific setup with which you're measuring your data? In other words, you have a sensor, you have an emitter at the top, and you have a receiver at the bottom, and the sample is a certain size and so forth. Can you, like, if you were to change that constellation of sensors as in a field or in a different kind of setup, would, even if you were to constrain yourself to Carrara marble, could you finally claim that the model would apply? I don't know if the cross correlation stuff would filter some of that stuff, dependencies out.
Right.
I don't know. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, my sense would be, I think since we're looking at the coda, which is specifically the multiple reflected side of things, if your sensor is right next to each other, like the sensor and the receiver, or the source and the receiver, maybe that's a problem. But I think once you have some distance, I think we haven't done the test, and that's something that should be done. We need to do this. But I think it will not be very sensitive to that exact geometry, because you're primarily looking for stuff that's bounced around a bunch of times, right, in the sample, for instance. And you really don't want direct path effects, because that is not sensitive to the bulk of the sample.
I see.
So I think that's sort of part one. I think in terms of generalization, I think the generalization, again, I have some hope that this will generalize, let's say, for a Carrara marble in general, because of the fact that you take Carrara marble, it breaks in a certain way at a given temperature, right? Once I start making one defect that has an effect on the stress and that self-organizes things together. And really my interpretation of all the results is the reason it's UMAP or a few dimensional things are picking up is because it's picking up that correlation structure. If the damage could be completely random anywhere, then I think this will never work, because you'll need lots of sensors. I think the fact that once I make a crack or once I make a twin, that affects the next one, and that gets organized, that is what is generalizable across different Carrara marbles, right? And then if you go to different material, that interaction will be different, but that will be generalizable for that material in how it deforms and breaks.
I see. Thank you. Yeah, this was great.
Yeah.
Cool. Jessica, please go ahead.
That was a really nice discussion. Can I ask, is there a way, you're talking about this correlation structure of looking for something. Is there a way to force UMAP to only look for correlation structures? So also kind of force some sort of self-similarity into the data, kind of with the motivation that if this is ever going to scale up, then grain scales are not going to be totally relevant at all.
Right, right. I think, so if you use it, let's say in the field, I think some of the scales would be, should be good. So if you use it, let's say for ambient noise data, right? So you do cross correlation and then you use ambient noise and you do UMAP. It's going to pick up correlated structure in the same way, but I think rather than picking up correlated structure on the very fine scale, you're looking correlated structure at the larger scale. So like, again, a large fracture and how that's interacting, that gets organized. I don't know whether at the grain scale, I think there is enough local scale interaction that stuff becomes really correlated, right? So that you only end up with a few types of deformation modes. I don't know whether that will, at some point in time, that's not going to keep going as you become larger and larger volume spaces. That's going to break apart, that assumption. But that would be the hope to try this on the larger scale. We've done it with, rather than just giving the original waveform, you use cross-correlated waveform. So you actually do cross-correlation before. It helps a little bit, doesn't change stuff too much. It mostly still works fine. So there's some tricks there to maybe do some pre-processing of your data in a way that you're removing some correlated structure or adding correlated structure. I haven't thought too much about that to some extent yet, but that's a really good point to think about.
Cool.
Thanks.
Tushar, I have a couple questions.
Yes.
And one is super trivial. So in the brittle stuff that in the brittle regime, did you notch the samples first, or did they really just break in those beautiful images?
They just break. They just break in that way. I think it's an intact sample that you.
Yeah. But okay, it must have done a lot of work to make the samples really precise, because lots of times at low normal stress like that, you don't get such nice, clean fractures.
Right.
Yeah. Then I also had a question about, I don't know, it came up to me a couple different times, but slide 47 in particular, you show, just in general, you're trying to, predict stress and strain. And it just occurred to me when you're looking at that, because you're not in a time series, you're trying to predict some things that are not essentially not a single valued function. Like, you have all these different curves from different experiments. I know that's part of your goal, but then you could have the equivalent of hysteresis loops in any given experiment. And that just seems like a, I don't know, an ill-posed problem almost, like that you would expect a model to be able to pull out that hysteresis loop.
Like, I think that's a good point. I think, I guess what I was trying to test was the idea that if let's say you have a hysteresis loop in strain, right, in stress strain history, it's a hysteresis in stress strain. So in that case, it's not unique, but if you're looking at the velocity and the amplitude and the waveform structure, that is still changing, right? That's not, even if in hysteresis, you're not coming back exactly the same point. And you're asking, okay, can you map that directly back to what's happening with a given stress and strain? I think that, one could improve the prediction a fair bit if you said, I'm not going to give you just a given time step, but give me 100 time steps or 10 time steps, right? I know something about the history of the sample that would help improve it. I just wanted to kind of try the worst case and see, you give it everything and see, like, is there enough information versus it just gives you a scatter completely. But I think that, like, if in terms of optimizing the model, there are ways definitely to do that. I think the fact that it actually picks out, again, these experiments are not hysteresis loops, so right, I think it should still work.
Right,
You need
right.
experiments that are actually doing those and collecting the data and seeing, okay, how bad do you need to, how bad does stuff,
Mhm.
when does stuff
Yeah.
break completely versus when does stuff break kind of, and what is that telling you about?
Yeah,
Because still
yeah.
there's the state parameter is still evolving, essentially,
Right.
even in a hysteresis loop.
Mhm.
And if you're picking that up, you should be able to still map it back to the same strain combination, strain stress combination.
It's really cool. Yeah, it's a really good idea to try to pull out all those details and try to pull out the evolution of the brittle to ductile transition in terms of what you see about distributed deformation. So yeah, really interesting. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, and we are nearly out of time, but maybe not if there's one more quick question.
I have a quick one.
Yeah, please.
I wonder if you are also considering other parameters in your analysis. I have a student of mine that has worked on the peak delay that actually for the scattering is very powerful. You average the direct wave with the beyond the direct wave with respect to the energy on the wave of the coda wave. And so just asking if you're sticking with these parameters. Also, you have a plan to expand the seismic attributes to consider.
I'm open. I think what I started with was kind of the things people typically use, and then using these UMAP features to get some of the waveform characteristics. But yeah, if there are other suggestions, I would be happy to try and include them and see what the sensitivity is. So yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
send something and then we can communicate. Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be awesome. Thanks.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking Tushar for a really interesting talk and a great discussion. A lot of thought-provoking stuff. So
yes, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Tushar.
Tushar.
That
thanks so much.
From